There is a huge mistake in how we think about the American Revolution. We often imagine it was just a few famous men signing a paper or a single battle that changed everything. But the truth is that the British Empire didn't just lose a war. They lost their grip on a massive trade network they had spent over 100 years building. In 1763, Great Britain was the most powerful force on Earth. They had just defeated France, taken control of most of North America, and owned the world's largest navy. They were a closed system, self-sufficient, proud, and seemingly untouchable. Yet, within just 20 years, their entire American structure shattered. It didn't happen because of a sudden accident. It happened because of a series of policy decisions that turned their own colonies into their greatest rivals. If you looked at the British Empire after 1763, you would see a government that wanted to control every cent of profit from the New World. They had spent a mountain of money on the 7 Years' War and were deep in debt. To pay their soldiers and keep their government running, they needed a way to squeeze money out of the American colonies. But the Americans had spent decades running their own trade and making their own rules. The British government was desperate. They needed to force the colonies back into a system where every piece of paper, every box of tea, and every gallon of wine paid a tax directly to London. What they found was a specific set of laws that targeted the very foundation of colonial business and law. By the time the British leaders realized what was happening, the money that had built their empire was being used to fund a rebellion against them. The relationship didn't just break, it flipped. This is the story of how the world's most powerful empire was pushed out not just by an army, but by an economic war that turned the colonies from a source of wealth into a massive financial drain. Before we look at the first moves in this struggle for power, tell me in the comments, do you think a government can keep control if it loses the trust of the people who pay the bills? To understand the collapse of British power in America, you have to understand how the empire paid for its global reach. In the 18th century, war was the most expensive thing a government could do. After defeating France, the British treasury was empty. They had a debt of £122 million, which was an astronomical amount at the time. They set new rules. They told the American colonies that because the British Army had protected them from the French, the colonies had to pay for that protection. This was the debt trap. The British government enacted the Stamp Act in 1765. This law required colonists to pay a tax on every piece of printed paper they used. Legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. This wasn't just about money. It was about who held the power to make the rules. For the first time, London was reaching directly into the pockets of the colonists without asking their local governments. The British thought this was a fair way to get their money back. But to the Americans, it felt like a total loss of control. If the king could tax their paper today, he could tax their land, their houses, and their lives tomorrow. The impact was immediate. For the first time, the different colonies, which usually didn't get along, began to work together. They realized that if they didn't stop this now, the British government would keep tightening the pressure. They didn't just complain, they attacked the trade. They stopped buying British goods. Ships full of English cloth and tools sat in the harbors because no one would buy them. This put massive pressure on the merchants back in London. The British government had tried to solve its debt problem, but instead, they had created an economic wall that was cutting off their own profits. The crisis reached a breaking point when the British realized they couldn't even collect the tax. The people they sent to sell the stamps were threatened and forced to quit. The law was on the books, but the government had no power to enforce it. To save face, London took the law back, but they passed another rule saying they had the absolute power to make any laws they wanted for the colonies. The British had found the one thing that could break the trust of their American subjects. They tried to treat them like a conquered people, rather than partners in trade. When the British government realized the Stamp Act had failed, they didn't stop. They just changed their tactics. They still had a massive debt to pay, and they still believed the colonies should provide the money. In 1767, they passed the Townshend Acts. Instead of a direct tax on paper, they placed a tax on essential goods that the colonies had to import from Britain, things like glass, lead, paint, and tea. The British logic was simple. If the Americans wanted these goods, they had to pay the tax. There was no other way to get them legally. But this plan had a massive flaw. The British had spent years ignoring the fact that the Americans were masters of smuggling. To avoid the new rules, colonial merchants started trading with the Dutch and the French in secret. The British responded by sending more ships and more inspectors to the American coast. They used writs of assistance, which were basically blank search warrants that let officials break into any building or ship to look for untaxed goods. This wasn't just a fight over money anymore. It was a fight over the right to own property without the government barging in. The tension turned into a physical struggle for control in the streets of Boston. The British sent 2,000 soldiers to a city of only 16,000 people to make sure the taxes were collected and the rules were followed. This was a massive show of force. The presence of a standing army in a time of peace made the colonists feel like they were under occupation. Every time a soldier stopped a merchant or a sailor, the resentment grew. The British thought the army would bring order, but it actually became a target for the people's anger. By 1770, the economic pressure was hurting British merchants so much that London backed down again, except for one thing. They kept the tax on tea. They wanted to prove they still had the right to tax the colonies. This was a huge mistake. Tea was the most popular drink in the empire, and by keeping that one tax, the British kept the conflict alive. They had turned a common trade product into a symbol of government force. The colonies were no longer just looking for lower taxes. They were looking for a way to break free from the British trade system entirely. By 1773, the British government faced a new problem. The East India Company, their most important corporation, was almost bankrupt. To save it, they passed the Tea Act. This law allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a very low price, even lower than smuggled Dutch tea. But there was a catch. The tea still carried the Townshend tax. The British thought the Americans would choose cheap tea over their political principles. They were wrong. They hadn't realized that the colonists saw this as another trap to force them to accept London's right to tax them. In December 1773, a group of colonists in Boston took action. They boarded British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. This wasn't just a protest. It was a massive destruction of property worth about $1.7 million in today's money. To the British government, this was the final straw. They had tried to manage the colonies through trade rules and taxes, but now the Americans were using force to stop the empire's business. The king and parliament decided that the only way to get the money and control back was to crush the resistance. The British responded with the Coercive Acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. They shut down the port of Boston, stopping all trade until the tea was paid for. They also changed the rules of the local government, taking power away from elected officials and giving it to a British general. This move backfired completely. Instead of scaring the other colonies into following the rules, it made them realize that their own ports and governments could be next. The British had turned a local trade dispute into a continental power struggle. By 1774, the colonies formed the First Continental Congress. They didn't just talk, they organized a total boycott of all British goods. They created a Continental Association to enforce these rules in every town and village. If a merchant tried to sell British cloth or tea, they were treated as an enemy of the people. The British government had lost its ability to collect money, and now it was losing its ability to enforce its own laws. The struggle for control was moving out of the counting houses and into the streets by 1775. The British government realized that rules and taxes were no longer enough to maintain control. They decided to use their army to seize the colony's military supplies. They knew that without gunpowder and weapons, the colonial resistance would collapse. When British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord to capture these resources, they weren't just looking for guns, they were trying to break the colony's ability to use force. But the mission failed. The British were pushed back to Boston, and for the first time, a full-scale military conflict had begun. The British strategy now shifted to a total naval blockade. They used their massive navy to cut off the colonies from the rest of the world's trade. They believed that if the Americans couldn't sell their tobacco, indigo, and grain to Europe, their economy would die and they would be forced to surrender. This was a war of economic pressure. The British also used their power to recruit outside help, hiring thousands of German soldiers to bolster their ranks. They treated the American colonies like a foreign enemy territory rather than a part of their own empire. However, this military force came with a massive price tag. Every soldier sent across the Atlantic and every ship kept on the coast cost the British treasury more money it didn't have. To fund the war, the British had to borrow even more, driving their debt to record levels. Meanwhile, the Americans began to find their own ways to pay for the fight. They stopped using British money and started printing their own paper currency. They also began making their own gunpowder and weapons, creating a local industry to replace what they used to buy from London. The biggest blow to the British came in 1778, when France entered the war. This changed everything. France didn't just send soldiers, they sent a navy that could challenge British control of the seas. Now, the British had to defend their other colonies in the Caribbean and even their own shores in England. They could no longer focus all their power on America. The war had escalated from a colonial rebellion into a global struggle for power that was draining the British Empire's resources faster than they could replace them. The end of British power in America came down to a simple calculation of costs versus gains. By 1781, the British were trapped in a war they could no longer afford to win. At the Battle of Yorktown, the British Army was surrounded by American forces on land and a French fleet at sea. When the British commander surrendered, it wasn't just a military defeat. It was a total collapse of the British strategy to hold the colonies by force. The British government realized that even if they won more battles, the cost of keeping an army in America to collect taxes would be higher than the taxes themselves. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and Great Britain officially recognized the United States as an independent nation. The British Empire had lost its most valuable source of raw materials and its biggest market for manufactured goods. This was a massive blow to their global structure. They had tried to use strict rules and military pressure to maintain a monopoly on American trade, but that very pressure had forced the colonies to build their own government, their own army, and their own economic system. The British were kicked out because they tried to treat their partners like property. The story of the American Revolution is a lesson in the limits of power. A superpower can have the largest navy and the most money, but it cannot survive if it destroys the economic trust of its own people. The British didn't just lose a piece of land, they lost the logic that held their Atlantic empire together. By trying to solve their debt problem with force, they created a rival that would eventually surpass them. The empire didn't end in America because of a single battle, but because it had become too expensive and too difficult to maintain a system that the people on the ground no longer accepted.